Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Previously, our identities were largely defined by factors such as gender, nationality, religion, marital status, finances, and age. However, times are changing. With populations becoming more diverse, our old identities, like ill-fitting shoes, may be hindering our process. Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the X Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net. With us this hour to reevaluate identity is Jaï Bristow. Jaï is a multi-ethnic, queer, disabled, diversity, equality, inclusion, identity, belonging coach and consultant who has been facilitating groups around social identity since 2016. Jaï offers workshops on power, privilege, and prejudice to become aware of and find freedom from oppressive structures in society and in oneself. Bristow's work is inspired by life experiences, mindfulness and inquiry practices, and NVC and trauma healing tools. Jaï's website, jaïbristow.com. Jaï, thanks for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Hi, Gwilda. Thank you so much for having me today.
It's just a pleasure to have you here. You're coming all the way from Gay Paris, yes?
Yes, Paris. Hello, bonjour.
Bonjour, monsieur. Okay, so let's clarify some things in your bio. What is a diversity, equality, inclusion, identity, and belonging coach?
So I basically work with individuals, duos, and groups to help people understand their social identities and where they fit into the world, right? You talked a little bit about gender and race, sexual orientation, family structures. All those kind of things can leave imprints on us. And sometimes it can be difficult to navigate in a world where we're told that certain groups and people are superior or inferior based on that categorization. So I support people as they navigate all of that. And so that's what I do when I'm coaching. And as a consultant, I work with groups and organizations and companies to look at like the different power dynamics and how to create a more inclusive and adapted work environment or group environment to support everyone involved.
That sounds like a tall order. So, NVC and trauma healing tools, what are those?
So NVC is nonviolent communication.
Okay.
It was originally designed by Marshall B. Rosenberg, and it's a way of it combines different tools which support people to connect to the core feelings and the core needs, and then look at strategies that support people in connecting through those core feelings and needs. And we see that often we think, oh, I need a chocolate cake right now, for example, right? And actually it's like, okay, that isn't in itself a need. That's a strategy, whether that's to meet a need for comfort or hunger or pleasure. And so that's what nonviolent communication is. The trauma healing, I've co-hosted a number of trauma summits and other online conferences around trauma healing. And I look at all the different methods that I've learned over the years. And I incorporate that into looking at how we can heal collective trauma altogether, because we all, in different ways, shapes, and forms, are suffering from trauma in our lives.
Now, you don't have a degree in psychology or anything, so you don't come at it from a psychological standpoint?
No, my training, I've studied various things and I've done lots of different courses. And I also speak a lot from my own life experiences. And I really see how that has taught me a lot, just through the different identities that you listed at the beginning, and also all the different trainings I've done over the years.
Got it. So, what are the labels around why are the labels around social identity so important?
So I think there's a different ways of looking at this, right? So one is just from a language perspective. It's a lot easier to say woman, for example, than to try and describe it. Just the same way it's easier to say I'm on a computer right now than to try and describe it. So we can use different labels just as shorthand to describe someone's identity, whether that's around their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, whether they're disabled or not, and all kinds of other factors. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is really about connecting with community. Because again, we live in a world which is very diverse, and there's a lot of different expressions and experiences and opinions out there. And we can sometimes feel quite isolated and alone when we have an experience that doesn't conform to what's considered the norm. And so if we know, for example, that we're trans, for example, then we find other people who have that shared experience, it can create a sense of belonging, a sense of community, which I think is really, really important.
Would you mind defining trans for us?
Yes. So when I'm talking about trans, I'm talking about being transgender, which means that your sense of self, your sense of gender, doesn't align with the one that was assigned to you at birth. So, for example, if you were told you're a woman but don't feel like a woman, or brought up as a man and don't feel like a man, that kind of thing is what transgender means. And that's what I
Gotcha.
refer to when I'm
Okay.
trans.
So the norm seems to be changing. We say, try to fit in with the norm, but isn't the norm changing? And if so, how?
So it depends what you mean exactly when you ask what the norm is changing, because I think there's still like very much dominant groups, right? So it's still considered normal to be, for example, cisgender, if we're talking about gender, which is the opposite of trans, which means when your gender identity does match with that which you were assigned with at birth. And so that's why people can feel sometimes different when their identities don't match what's considered normal. But I don't know if it's that the norm so much is changing, or if it's that collective consciousness is evolving and we're starting to recognize the beautiful richness and diversity of the human experience, rather than having a very limited view and often very binary view. And I'm not just talking about gender here, I'm talking about all different aspects of identity when I say this.
Okay. Um, what are the limitations and problems with the identity labels?
So again, I talked about descriptors, but sometimes labels can become very prescriptive. We think we know what that label means, and we forget to get curious. We forget to ask people, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to you to be a woman or a man? What does it mean to you to um, to do the role you do, so we have to be very careful not to assume that we know what something is and to put people in boxes, which is the other issue. We tend to hierarchize each other all the time and dehumanize each other by putting each other in very, very narrow boxes, and that can be very challenging and painful when those boxes don't match our experience.
Or our desires. I know that I grew up in a time when being female was definitely a second class citizen,
Exactly.
and I had to push through all of that to do a lot of the things that I enjoy doing because they were traditionally male roles. Um, and so, of course, that leaves its scars, doesn't it? Having to, my brother was expected to be better than I was, and I think the pressure of that about took him out. So, it's just, I don't think it serves anyone. And yet, 50% of the population or better is female. So it's not a minority.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a great example because, as you said, that pressure and the comparison between the two of you actually took its toll on both of you, right? Because you were being told that you were limited in what you could achieve because of your gender. And he was being told he had to achieve better than you because of his gender. So there's all these expectations and these roles and this pressure that we put on people. And that's what I mean by the restrictive boxes. It can feel very like alienating. And why am I being told that this is what I should quote unquote do, and how I should behave and how I should feel, and all these shoulds and expectations can become very wearisome and very tiring.
Do you find that when people try to step out of the boxes, they have to perform way better than the ones that aren't in the box to start out with?
Absolutely. I think that people who belong to any kind of marginalized group or like minority often are expected to represent and to do better than people who are in the dominant group. So let's take the example you were giving earlier about men and women, and if we're talking about gender, that idea that if a woman fails, it's that women are bad at such and such. Whereas if a man fails, then it's just he wasn't good at the job. But again, it goes beyond gender. We see that often with racial dynamics when a person of color, a Black person or other person of color doesn't do as well as a white person, then it becomes a stereotype. It's like they're expected to represent the entire race that they belong to. And we see that with disability. We see it with all kinds of different dynamics. And so absolutely.
You speak of oppressive structures in society, and we've been talking about some of them. Would you name a few more?
Yeah. So we see, like with patriarchy, this inherent idea that cisgendered men are somehow the dominant group and are somehow superior, whether it's explicit or not. I think previously it's definitely been more explicit, and now it's kind of more embedded in society. It's more subtle, but it still takes its toll because we all internalize those messages. Whatever our gender, we internalize the idea that certain people are superior and certain people are inferior. And if we're part of the group which is considered superior, we internalize that just as much as if we're part of the group that's considered inferior. So whether we're talking about patriarchy or white supremacy or, ableism, there's all these different words which can sometimes feel scary to people because these words have been associated with people feeling attacked for who they are. And so I think it's really important to remind people that none of us choose our social identities. We don't choose our gender, regardless of what that is. We don't choose our racial background, regardless of what that is. We don't choose our sexual orientation. These are just parts of who we are and make up a big part of our experience as we move through the world. And I think that that's really beautiful, that there is so much diversity across all of these. And what's really challenging is the fact that those experiences and those identities are hierarchized, and that people are considered better than or lesser than simply because of who they are, which is not part of their choice.
If we look at the other side of it, though, the people that are considered better than,
Mhm.
doesn't that kind of put a low bar and they don't have to become all that they can be because they feel like they've already arrived?
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think it's possibly that can happen, right? Like I know in the US at the moment, there's a big thing around DEI hiring, for example. But then, and it's interesting because when we look at that, it's often the messaging is we want to hire the best, and people don't understand that sometimes the best is giving opportunities to other people who are the best but wouldn't get the opportunities because of inherent bias and the internalization of those messages. So I don't know if it means that people make less of an effort, but probably. And
Sometimes, yeah. Well,
yeah, and I don't know if people are aware of that necessarily either.
we're going to have to take a station break. Jai and I will return very shortly, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Could we be our own oppressors? With us this hour discussing possible oppressive structures in society and within ourselves is Jaï Bristow. Jai's website, jaibristow.com. We've been talking up until now about different systems or ways of looking at things that oppress people, inadvertently or advertently. However, what about the oppressor from within? We aren't told that we don't have to buy into this, do we?
Well, that's the thing. We're all so conditioned by these messages that a lot of the time we don't even realize that we're the ones keeping ourselves trapped, that we're the ones keeping ourselves in boxes, right? And so there's different words for this, whether we talk about the inner critic or the judgmental voices in our head, or, I've also heard of it referred to as super ego, or in Buddhist tradition as Mara. But all of this is pointing to the same thing, that because of the messaging we receive throughout our lives, we can be very judgmental, and we can turn that inwards towards ourselves and or outwards towards others. And we see that we're keeping the loop in play, right? So all these messages we were talking, whether we're talking about gender or race or other things, that we keep ourselves trapped often in a very limited possibility. And which reminds me of the question you asked previously about people from the dominant culture. Are they limiting themselves from, doing as much or trying as hard, perhaps? And there's all these different ways that we actually end up harming ourselves without even realizing it, which is why it's so important to be able to have these conversations in order to raise awareness, because that's how we can shift patterns and break unhealthy habits and do something different and new and begin to heal together instead of harm each other.
I know that one of the things, again, if we talk about gender, we talk about being female. I've known a lot of women that, they're really angry because they were in a situation like mine where the boy got the car, and even though he was younger, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they're come on, they're in their 50s now, okay, and they're still angry, but yet they don't seem to know it. Is this part of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. So I think this is what I'm referring to when I talk about collective trauma, right? And the way trauma works is that an incident happens in our life which is painful and it hurts us. And there is no way of avoiding hurt in life, whether it's emotional or physical hurt. Pain happens, and that's normal. But what happens with trauma is that there's an incident that hurts us, and then there's not the holding environment for our nervous system to reset. And then it kind of gets frozen in time. So it makes sense that if we don't get the opportunity to become aware and express that and begin to heal that trauma, then those patterns will get caught in us. And if we've never had the opportunity to express anger or the unfairness or all kinds of other frozen emotions, that's going to continue to become a huge part of us and is going to get activated and triggered every time that situation seems to repeat itself. And then we inevitably cast people in our lives who play the right roles for our patterns. So we constantly feel like it's the same routine. And then we end up with people in our lives who make us feel like we did back then. And in some way, it's an opportunity to break that pattern, but we can't do that until we become aware of that.
So that sounds again like we're getting into psychiatric work and counseling work. What other approach is there for us to go within that doesn't require a degree in psychology?
Like I said, I've hosted a number of trauma summits online, and there's so many free resources that offer so many different tools. And psychology and psychiatry are definitely some options that are supportive, but there's also a lot of other ones, right? Whether it's mindfulness work, or I mentioned nonviolent communication, or whether it's sensing practices, or all kinds of different, or coaching, sitting with someone and just taking the time to go inwards and have a holding environment that our nervous system can allow the feelings to arrive, and then have the cycle complete and reset. And then we can let go of these parts that we've been holding on to for so long, and enable us to start to heal and move forward from that.
So hanging on to those, like hanging on to the anger that I spoke of earlier, actually takes us out of who we are, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And not just does it take us out of who we are, but it kind of becomes so much part of our identity that it's not just that it takes us out of who we are, but it becomes a persona of who we are. It creates this new part that we don't know who we are without that anger, because it's been alive in us for so long. And so that's why this work can be very challenging when we look at our identities and our patterns and our trauma behaviors. And it's also really valuable and liberating, because it allows us to find different new options and to build resources and capacity internally and externally to have more spaciousness. And that when we're confronted with something, that can activate some anger, we don't need to respond in familiar ways. It doesn't add so many layers that we get overstimulated and overactivated, and we can learn to respond rather than react. We can learn to take a minute to, I see what's going on here, and therefore I have space to adapt to the situation in a tuned way rather than just immediately react without realizing that that's what we're doing.
So it's kind of like becoming your own witness.
That's a big part of it, absolutely. Um, but it's about getting to know ourselves, to understand and bringing in some compassion that, this anger, for example, or these other parts that we've been holding on to, that they're very normal human experiences. It's not about trying to get rid of them. It's actually about welcoming them and embracing them and understanding them and bringing in enough compassion and spaciousness that we don't need to hurt ourselves or other people when we're confronted with them.
So if we deal with the oppression found within ourselves, how does it affect our relationship to those found in society?
The oppressive structures in ourselves and in society, is that what you're asking about?
What I'm saying is, if we deal with the oppressor within,
Mhm.
how does that change the way we respond to things that would try to oppress us from without?
Oh, massively, because suddenly we can see that it's all a projection, right? And that we're no longer believing into it. And if we're not buying into it in the same way, it doesn't take its toll as much. It doesn't suddenly make everything happening in society stop happening, but it gives us a lot more capacity to be able to face the situation. It also creates what I call the positive ripple effect, which is, the cliche hurt people, healed people, heal people. If we're able to do our work to look at the oppressor within and find freedom from that oppressor within, then it allows us to support people doing that work around us. And I know that as I've been doing this work over the years, that so much has changed within me, but also I see it in all my social circles and networks that people are also impacted, and then they're able to have these difficult conversations with people around them. And, you know, I'm fortunate that my grandparents are still alive, and they come from a very different culture and class and era than me. And yet we're able to connect and find commonality and love between us and have conversations around gender and race and politics and all these kind of topics that can be very activating and very polarizing for so many people. And we're able to do that only when we take the time to look within and to build that capacity to not get so activated, as I said, to have the capacity to respond and meet the other person where they're at, rather than get super reactive and see the other person as an enemy.
Let's talk about the energetics of that, because I think we've all experienced being in a room with somebody that accepts themselves, ergo, they accept everything around them. And you can just feel that. Okay. And we've also been in the room with somebody that's just waiting for an excuse, right, to dump the anger on something. But that's really at the invisible level, isn't it? Do you feel
Absolutely.
do you feel that this kind of inner work where you start to accept yourself manifests energetically and that changes things around you as well?
100%. And I would also say, with the two examples you gave, I say they're two sort of ends of a spectrum, right? And actually, the ideal situation is neither one nor the other, because if we go too much into we don't care what's happening around us, that's something that's known as bypassing. We go into this state of like, we don't necessarily feel the harm that's being caused. We can sometimes hear language around we're all one, we're just one human race, and that denies and ignores the reality of people who face racial discrimination on a daily basis, who are hurt by the racial systems in place of white supremacy, if we want to use that language, or whatever language we use, right? And so it's important that we build resilience and capacity without bypassing and ignoring the reality that is faced by so many people on a daily basis that is causing harm. equally, if we're in that other state where you're saying, we're just waiting for something to happen, that is often a trauma response. And that takes its toll and is exhausting for us and for everyone around us. And again, creates more friction, more conflict, more division, more polarization. And so in the work that I do, it's really about finding ways of building bridges between different social groups, social identities, being able to have conversations which both reconnect to the humanity in the other and reconnect to our own humanity without bypassing the myriad of different experiences that each person can have.
Isn't one of the difficulties we run into is there's kind of this overlording feeling that if we accept a person's point of view, then we're agreeing with it and have to take it on.
So it depends, again, what often happens and what can be at the cause of a lot of conflicts around these topics is that people mix up points of view or perspective or opinions with lived experience. And so it's really important to distinguish when we're talking about an opinion and when we're talking about a lived experience. I think it's okay to have different opinions about things. Maybe I prefer the color red and you prefer the color blue, for example. Those are preferences, those are opinions. You think the color blue is the best color, I think the color red is the best color, right? And then it's okay that we can have differing opinions. It's actually interesting. Oh, why do you love the color blue? What does it remind you of? Why do you think it's the best color? Oh, why do I like the color red? And then we might be able to see it from the other person's perspective, and maybe that will change us, or maybe it won't, and we'll just appreciate that we have different opinions, different preferences, different perspectives. However,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we're talking about lived experience, it's very different. If I'm saying, oh, I faced racial discrimination as a brown person, and you tell me, I don't think so, I don't believe that racism exists, for example, then that's not a difference of opinion. That's really harmful. It's a bit like what you were talking about with gender, with you and your brother growing up, right? If people ignore that difference of lived experience, it's hurtful because you know it to be true in your bones, even if sometimes it's hard to prove, for example.
So being able to stay in the center of who you are sounds like a heck of a challenge in our society. Yeah. So we are going to have to take another commercial break. Jaï and I will be right back to continue our discussion. So please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org, and we're coming to you through the X Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net. Do you find it difficult to stay current on what's politically correct? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing identity is Jaï Bristow. His website, jaïbristow.com. So, Jaï, we were going into the restrictiveness of identities, even when we don't know it. But do you see identity labels found in society changing at this point?
Absolutely. So the labels themselves might be changing, but the actual identities, I think, have always existed. So we've talked quite a bit about gender today, and we've talked a bit about, being a man versus being a woman, for example. And more we're seeing people who don't fall into that binary. And I myself am one of those people. And it's really interesting how that people think that that's a very modern trend, whereas actually going beyond this gender binary has existed since across cultures and centuries far back into history, right? And that's true again when we have conversations about race. We're always talking about black and white. And there's so many of us are multiracial or just have a race that isn't black or white, Asian people, for example. I'm part black, part white, part Asian myself. So again, I've often been confronted with these binaries, or we think of someone who is disabled as someone in a wheelchair permanently, when so many of us have chronic illnesses which are considered invisible disabilities because we are impacted in our day to day, and yet it's not noticed by other people. And so, with all these different factors, I think the language is evolving and changing to be able to name these different experiences, to be able to, yeah, connect with each other, especially as the digital era continues to progress, and people are able to communicate with people from around the world and be like, oh, what you're describing matches my experience. I didn't know it had a name, for example. So the language is definitely evolving, but the experiences themselves, I think, have always been around.
I would agree with you. I was trained by a Lakota elder, and he spoke of the gay people being very much revered for generations with his people. And so, obviously, it's been around a long time and has been treated differently by different cultures. Where some
Absolutely.
cultures are very open with it, and other cultures are like, "Oh, don't get that on me," kind of thing. So, what's the collective trauma that you mentioned?
So we've talked about it a little bit, this idea, like whether it's around gender or race, the ways that we all internalize that messaging and that kind of inner oppressor, which can contribute to the collective trauma. But another way that I like to describe it is anyone who's done any trauma healing work, we know that a lot of our trauma starts in childhood, right? But if we look at the reasons that trauma has happened, often it's intergenerational. And if we zoom out even more, we see that often it's systemic. A lot of the trauma comes from, like you talked about, like gender dynamics, or and around, women being told that they are very limited in what they're allowed, quote unquote, to do or be. And that's going to take its toll and have an impact. And then they're going to pass that down to their children, and then before we know it, we have generations and generations of people who have this trauma, whether it's around gender or race or all these other social identities that have been named today.
There's another factor that's really starting to come to the fore, and that's epigenetics and DNA. There's increasing evidence, from what I've heard from some of my very, very expert guests, that these traumas are passed down through the DNA as well as just nature nurture kind of thing. Um, have you heard of that? And what's your take on that?
Absolutely. And I think, again, it's multifaceted, right? I've also heard about this, the DNA, when we look at intergenerational trauma. And of course, the environment is also a huge part of that. And the environment take factors in all these like different systems of oppression. Again, these are words that people don't necessarily like to hear. And I understand that they're uncomfortable words, but they're true words as well. And we have to take into account all of it and take a holistic look at trauma, the environment, both familial and societal, whether that's local or on a bigger scale, the cultures that we grow up in, the messaging within each culture. And then we can also look at the DNA. And then we also look at the personal, because we still all have our personal experiences and reactions. And we see that siblings might have, you know, patterns in common, but will also have their own unique experiences.
I think that what I've seen is growing up multicultural, like traveling a lot, like if you're in the military as a child, or your folks are in the military, can really broaden your horizons. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and of course, you talk about a redheaded female. That's not a good place for you. Okay. Um, but if you're in a society and you're starting to learn what their norms are, and how not to push the buttons within that society, how to stay within that little box, doesn't that eventually broaden your horizons as to how you view your own?
Very possibly. I'm someone, I grew up, I traveled a lot as a child with my family, and my family also had a meditation center where we received people from all around the world.
Mhm.
And that immediately helped me become aware that there is not just one way of being human, right? That people look and sound and experience all kinds of different yeah, experiences and ways of being. And I remember I was maybe 6 and I was in India on a train, and someone who had, one limb left and was dragging themselves across the train floor and had, like, a plate in their mouth, asking for money, and it was a shock to me because I hadn't experienced or seen that, and we tend to live in echo chambers where the people around us have very similar experiences to us because we all grow up in the same environment. And then when we have the ability to, yeah, experience different cultures, different environment, to talk to people who have different experiences, that definitely opens our mind and we see that the human experience is far more complex and interesting and rich and diverse than we might imagine if we don't have the opportunity to step outside of our immediate culture.
Well, here's the other side of that coin. As we've experienced with all the immigration and this sort of thing, and a world in drama, sometimes you take, one religion, one ethnic group, and dump them into the area of another one's, and things don't go well. It actually divides people more than it brings them together. What's your take on that?
Well, once again, I'm a big believer in building bridges and communicating. And I think it requires from everyone involved to understand that there is that difference. And that difference isn't necessarily a bad thing, quite the opposite. It's an opportunity for us to learn from each other and grow and evolve. It's okay to have differences in opinions, differences in experiences. What's not okay is when we are convinced that who we are and how we see the world and our opinions are the only way or the right way or the better way, and then that can create a lot of friction. But I have friends and people in my life from all different backgrounds, all different religions, all different cultures and ethnicities, all different genders, and it works when people are approach situations with curiosity as opposed to defensiveness.
And defensiveness comes from the pain body, though, doesn't it? The damage.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Which
So
again brings me back to what I was saying earlier, the importance of doing the work on ourselves and doing the trauma healing and becoming aware of our patterns and the pain that's been caused. And so that we understand where that defensiveness comes from, so that we gain autonomy to make different choices. So that when we're faced with these situations, we don't go onto autopilot, but we actually regain our free will and are able to do things differently in a way that's not just perpetuating these harmful cycles, but actually breaking those cycles.
do you think that as we can use our triggers as a guide, if you will? So if I'm in a situation and all of a sudden somebody just triggers the daylights out of me, if I stop, take a deep breath, and go, where did that come from? Okay, looking within versus looking without and projecting the trauma that I feel within. Do you think that we can use it as a medicine, if you will?
Yes, I'd say they're like alarm bells, our triggers, right? It's saying alert, 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 pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And I think when we're doing this work, we both need to be able to look inwards and notice that we're triggered. But it can be really hard to do because when we're triggered, we're literally in a trauma response. We're disconnected from ourselves. We're not thinking straight. And that's why it's also important that we can recognize when someone else has been triggered so that we can create some safety for that person, for their nervous system to regulate before we continue with whatever's been said. And being able to create that safety, that security, that holding for the regulation of the nervous system is imperative to breaking these harmful cycles. So it's really important that we can know ourselves. And in knowing ourselves, it's also important that we have the ability to tune in and to connect to other people and to realize, oh, that person's been triggered. So rather than me getting frustrated that they're having a strong reaction, or feeling victimized by their reaction, or thinking they're attacking me, or whatever it is. It's okay, something's happening here. I don't know if it's that person's personal history, if it's something systemic to do with, their environment, or their identities, or whatever it is, but something's happening. Let's just slow everything down, take a pause. What's happening in me? How can I support the person? So it's always the both and, the learning to get to know ourselves, and also looking for those alarms in other people, so that we can again attune and support each other in the healing journey, which needs to be a collective process, as opposed to taking the individual responsibility all the time.
It seems like today, and I know it's always been around, but it seems like today polarization is a real issue. Okay. I know you go on social media, no matter where you go, there's this side and then there's this side, and they're stirring the pot, trying to get everybody else all stirred up about it. Now, I know that's been going on forever, but it seems like it's more intense right now. And yet we're supposed to be entering into an era of more unity. What's going on?
Yeah, good question. I wish I had one simple, easy answer. I think, again, it's the pros and cons of social media, right? On the one hand side, it allows us to connect with people from all over the world, to embrace the diversity and variety of the human in existence. On the other hand, the algorithms really emphasize these echo chambers that I mentioned earlier, where suddenly everyone seems to have the same opinion as us, and therefore it's reinforcing the us versus them, that we're right, therefore they're wrong, whatever your opinion is, whatever your stance is. And I see it across, the political spectrums, across all different identities, that there's this real belief that if I'm right, they must be wrong. And that there's a unwillingness often to question, and like I said, to come in with curiosity and be like, why do you believe that? Why is this important for you? Where is this coming from? And also with the hopes that the other person will then be able to open up and respond, and allow us to then share what's happening with us. And that's where nonviolent communication is excellent, because it offers tools around really listening to the other person, connecting to the needs and the feelings below all the surface of what's being said. And again, it can be challenging, because it can be very triggering. If someone's saying, something that directly impacts my lived experience, like I said, opinions and experiences aren't the same thing, right? So if someone's saying something,
Well, I'm
there's a lot of
sorry.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
We're gonna have to leave this as a cliffhanger because it's time to take another station break. Stay tuned. Jai and I will delve deeper into our culture's ever-shifting identities. How can we feel accepted by others? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Jaï Bristow. Jai's website is jaibristow.com. Jai, it's from birth. It seems like life or death situation to be accepted. That's how important it feels to us, because let's face it, if you're not accepted, and if you're a pup in a litter and you're not accepted, you're dead. And I think that there's a lot of very deep conditioning that says if you're not accepted, you're dead. How much does that distort who we really are, and what's the antidote?
Yeah, absolutely. The longing for acceptance, for belonging, is a huge drive for all of us. And it can be really painful when we've been rejected. Many of us have experienced some form of rejection, whether that's bullying at school or being rejected in a relationship. And it really, really hurts. And it hurts on a deep, deep wound. And then for those of us who have identities which don't conform to the norm, we have extra layers of that. And it can be, again, quite traumatic, quite painful. And So even though it's a little cliche to say, there is a big part of it is learning to accept ourselves. And that is a huge journey, of course, because if we've internalized the messaging that there's something quote unquote wrong with us for simply who we are, whether that's to do with our sexual orientation or gender or anything else, that's going to be difficult to overcome when the messaging is continuing in society. And this is where community is such an important part of this healing journey. When we can connect with other people with shared experiences, it really helps us feel that sense of belonging and acceptance that who I am is not inherently fundamentally wrong. It's just different than the norm. So community care is a big part of it. Doing the tools to look within and to accept who we are is a big part of it. And it's something that's easy to say, but of course isn't necessarily that simple to do. It takes time, it takes work, but it's a really important part of the journey. And, sometimes it's okay that we don't belong in the mainstream, that we can find our people, our groups where we do feel that belonging and that acceptance.
On the other side, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here, but doesn't collecting in a group with an agreed upon reality, agreed upon this is okay, which is fine. But if you collect there and don't integrate with the rest of society, you just stay in your safe place. Doesn't that add to the problem of the polarization?
So I teach a lot about mirrors and windows, which is based on the work by Rudine Sims Bishop. And it's the concept that we all need mirrors, which are reflections of our own experience, and windows into the experience of other people. We need the mirrors in order to feel that sense of belonging and acceptance, in order to heal and have our nervous system relax and feel that kind of love and that desire to expand. And then we need the windows in order to learn and grow and evolve and understand that the world isn't just this echo chamber. So, once again, it's a very non binary way of looking at it. And it's the both and. There isn't just, if we go only connect with people who have the same lived experiences as us, then it creates those echo chambers. It creates the us versus them mentality. It creates the division, the polarization. But if we're constantly feeling like the odd one out and only being exposed to people and experiences that don't match our own lived experiences, then that's going to be very painful as well. So we really, really need both.
I can see where that would be the case. The one thing that we haven't talked about, we've touched on it just a little bit, is the great transmuter, which is love. Okay. If we are able to come into our hearts before we communicate with people that have very different ideas or lifestyles than ourselves, is that helpful? And if so, why?
It's absolutely helpful, and we still need to factor in the power dynamics, right? It's not fair to assume that everyone has to come in from the same place with that sense of love and accept each other all the time, because it's, if we take a very common hierarchy, like a workplace environment, if there's a boss and an employee, it's explicit that there is a hierarchy. When the boss says something, the employee has to listen in a certain way, or the employee's voice isn't as accepted as the boss's voice, right? And so there is this power dynamic which will impact the relationship, which will impact the dynamics and the ways that they experience the workplace. However, in society, those power dynamics are at play all the time, but aren't always explicit. And so again, this part that I was talking about like people who belong to dominant identities versus people with marginalized identities, that creates a power dynamic. It also impacts the trauma that we feel. So again, people with a lot of marginalization and face a lot of discrimination, have more trauma, are more likely to get activated and triggered than people who have existed in environments where they are the dominant person or group or identity, and therefore have received a lot of mirroring, feel this sense of a legitimacy in who they are, feel that sense of belonging and acceptance. And so I would say often, if you have more systemic privilege and therefore more power, then yes, please open your hearts, but also open your ears. Listen to the experiences of someone else. Because in this mirrors and window analogy, what happens is people from dominant groups, they have a lot of mirroring, but not many windows. And then people from more marginalized groups, they have a lot of windows, but not much mirroring. So yes, love is very important. Love can transmute a lot of things, and we also have to acknowledge the different power dynamics, the different lived experiences, the different toll that different identities can take through the ways that we're treated in society as opposed to the identities themselves.
When we're talking about gender identification, this becomes very, very, very difficult because all of our languages, there might be exceptions I just don't happen to know of, but all of our languages use gender. I mean, some of the languages even assign gender to inanimate objects, and you have to know which gender it is or you're not speaking properly. How much do you think this has to do with the difficulty that we're having about how to speak, how to call somebody, what to say, what's politically correct?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm in Paris right now and I speak French, and French is one of those languages which is incredibly gendered, right? You can't there's every word is gendered. And often people think that it's assigning gender to the inanimate object, but actually one way of thinking of it is just assigning gender to the words themselves, to the sounds of the words, and then that makes it a little easier. I think we're very fortunate in English that actually English is not a very gendered language. So English is one of the ways and languages that it's quite easy to adapt. And we see that when people struggle to adapt with different language and use they pronouns, for example, which has existed as a singular pronoun since before the time of Shakespeare, and that, the second pronoun you is also used singular and plural, and no one complains about that. So people who struggle in adapting, often what's happening is, again, it's the ways that we're conditioned, that we constantly are projecting gender onto people. We might not do it with inanimate objects the way other languages do, but we do have that conditioning. And so, like with everything and any ways that we evolve, we can just practice and come in with that same curiosity. When we're in doubt, we can ask people and remember that, there can be different layers of trauma. And if someone looks like they're getting triggered, then it's just creating that safety and that holding and allowing the nervous system to regulate rather than getting defensive or fearful. And that it's okay when things are changing and evolving, that people make mistakes. We just have to be willing to recognize that that's happening and, apologize and move on.
I like that. Apologize and move on. How does sharing ideas across diverse identities contribute to our evolution?
Oof. So if we think of an ecosystem, right, it's the diversity that allows for the evolution. And if we were all to think exactly the same, this whole conversation would be quite boring if we were just completely saying the same thing. And if every guest you had on always said the same thing, it's boring. We expand our minds, our consciousness, we evolve our ideas by communicating with people who have different opinions, who have different lived experiences. That's why, I was talking earlier, it's fascinating if coming back to something very simple and hopefully, quite easy for people to connect to, like having a different favorite color, right? If it's just rather than you're wrong, I'm right, or vice versa, but actually getting curious and connecting, and then we can suddenly see the beauty in all the different colors, as opposed to feeling like one has to be better than the other. There is no one way of living or one type of experience that is better than another. It's just different. And I think that that's quite beautiful and really important for us to connect to and recognize and embrace, as opposed to be afraid of and reject and contract.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the show, and no show can go by without my asking, Jai, what is your mission?
My mission is to support people in their journeys of liberation from, oppression within and without, but mostly it's about reconnecting to one's own humanity and that of others, because I really feel we're in a time where we're more focused on dehumanizing than rehumanizing. So that's my mission, I'd say.
That's a beautiful mission. Do you find that as you're doing that, your viewpoints expand and change, and who you are expands and changes?
Absolutely. That's one of what I most love about my work, whether I'm coaching a client or leading a course and listening to the questions or dialoguing with the people around me. I get to experience those different windows as well as those mirrors, right? I get to be challenged. I get to learn and grow and evolve. And it's exciting. I'm someone I'm very I love whether it's reading or talking to people and seeing how different people's brains work, how different people perceive the world and experience life. And I really, really love that aspect of my work.
And have you found your mission evolving as a result of that?
I think the mission itself remains the same of, you know, supporting people on their journeys and supporting myself on my journey of liberation. And then the different sometimes my opinions do change. Like, I think my inherent core values don't. Those are pretty steadfast, but my opinions or the strategies or some of the ways I think about certain things definitely evolve.
Well, unfortunately, Jai, the time has come that we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been my pleasure. Our guest this hour has been Jaï Bristow. Jaï is a diversity, equality, inclusion, identity, and belonging coach and consultant. To find out more about Jaï, all they have to offer, visit jaibristow.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, you can always visit our website, www.missionevolution.org. But please be sure to join me right here next time. This mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.